Hello lads and ladettes, good to see you again. And today's lesson is going to be, like I promised you last week, there was this big problem with glare because I don't have polarized filters on my studio. So it's kind of difficult to film a very professional looking video for both you and me. So I was struggling last week, as you could see, because I was receiving all the glare while I was painting, while you guys had a half-decent image. So yeah, like promised, I've decided to move to gouache or pastels or just very matte techniques, so you can always see everything. Hello everyone, good to see you guys texting. So I'm moving to... today I'm going to work with gouache. I chose to work with acrylic gouache. I prefer it to regular gouache. The brands I'm going to use are going to be Turner, so it's written here at the top, you know, Turner, or Holbein, which is written here at the bottom. And they happen to be both Japanese. It's just a coincidence. I didn't do it on purpose, but it seems Japanese do the very, very best acrylic gouache paints in the world. And there are also... there's here it is. There's a Spanish brand which I'm going to use occasionally called Vallejo. It's also acrylic gouache. The quality is slightly inferior to the Holbein or the Turner, because Vallejo has got less tinting strength, but it's very good for delicate mixes where you don't need like this this powerful color effect. So I will be using Vallejo as well. And finally, you can mix acrylic gouache with standard acrylics. So I'm using golden acrylic paints for some of the colors, some of the hues. And I also have a transparent white by De La Roni, which I'm going to use to gently tint some of the acrylic gouaches I have in here. So, question for the class. You already know you cannot use zinc white when you paint in oils because zinc white cracks. But question for the class, why am I using zinc white in acrylics? So why am I not using titanium white? Tell me the reason, okay? Please type it down while I prepare the image. So I'll be starting in a minute. While we get started, I want to show you a trick. So, Sangeeta, very cold, very cold. It's not opacity. Try again, try again. Which one is opaque? Titanium white or zinc white? Please write it down on, on the questionnaire below, and then I'll check the answers. Try again, try again. If you want to keep your acrylic paints moist for a very long time, you've got several tricks that you can use. One of them is to use a sprayer and sometimes just spray a bit of water onto the top of your paints. Another one is to have a wet substrate. So what I'm going to do is just use any kind of plastic box. It doesn't really matter. Then take a little bit of kitchen roll, just take a few sheets. Then put your sheets onto the plastic thing. There you are. And we're going to do a stay wet palette. You don't need to buy the very super expensive ones they sell in the art shop, because they just cost a fortune and you can do it yourself. So a plastic box, put some kitchen paper at the bottom, wet it. See, so I'm dripping water into here, so it's really, really wet. It should be quite wet. Not a lake or anything of that sort, but it needs to be fully wet and shiny, okay? Not just moist. Make sure it's wet. I know it's hard to see with this camera, but it is wet. There's water on the surface. And then what you're going to put on top is it's grease-proof paper, you know, baking paper, the one you take to the oven. So you put this on top. All right. Make sure you pick a brand where some moisture comes through the paper, because some brands are more waterproof than others. So you need to test. What you want is a palette that doesn't disintegrate as you rub with the brush. You know, that's why we don't use normal paper, because otherwise if you're rubbing with the brush, you get paper bits on your paint. So you want a palette that stays strong, but that allows some of the moisture to come through from underneath. Okay, so this is a stay wet palette. I also like to wet the top because it makes it faster. Now I feel, yes, now I feel that it's finally starting to drink the water from underneath. It's even wrinkling. Can you see? The paper is not straight anymore. It's starting to wrinkle. That's what we want. And this is your stay wet palette. So now you can paint with a stay wet palette. Now I've chose to do a landscape. And do you remember what was the subject of tonight's lesson? Do you remember the subject? We're going to work exclusively with Chroma. We're going to work exclusively with brighter colors or duller colors, and we will try to avoid too much contrasts of values. So we're going to try to avoid light and darkness, and indeed we're painting a landscape. And answering your question, the question I've asked before, the reason we are using zinc white is because zinc white is very transparent, and it has got a very, very weak tinting strength. It's very weak. So if I mix, let's say, if I mix titanium white with this blue, for example, I would have to put so little titanium white, otherwise the blue would turn super pale, you know? But the advantage of zinc white is that it's so weak that if I add a touch of this zinc white into the blue stays practically the same. And that's great, because I don't want the colors tonight to jump too much, too light or too dark, you know. I want to keep them all roughly the same value, roughly. With a little bit of light and dark. You always need light and dark. Otherwise your image doesn't really read, you know. But we are starting with very, very subtle colors. And yes, we're going to paint a landscape. And because the color interpretation is going to be very surreal, this is not how reality looks like. Because it's very surreal, I am going to paint mostly from imagination. So it's going to be... I picked some images from a place called Leiria, where my parents were born in Portugal. But I'm going to paint mostly from imagination. I also did a multitude of sketches. I did at least 20 sketches preparing for this painting. And the sketches are very random. It's just, you know, experimenting with roughness or with blurriness, or, you know, it's just studies. Unfortunately, this painting was meant to have been started in Portugal many months ago. All the sketches are in Lisbon now. But I still remember what I've done. So I'm going to start working on this page, and I have some reference photos if necessary on the internet. So it's not a problem. Whatever I don't remember, I can find out later. Right. So what I'm going to do is, for your exercise at home, I really want you to just try and paint with colors that have roughly the same value. So I want to make sure I'm going to paint with colors that will be very similar to this background blue. Even if I'm not using blue, I could be using red, I could be using a dark orange, I could be using a super dark yellow, like a dark yellow ochre. What matters is that the value is roughly the same as the background. Okay? So if you take a black and white photo of all the different colors I'm going to apply in here, they will be very, very similar in terms of shades of gray. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start first by reading a little bit of this book. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. I highly, highly recommend this book for everyone that has an interest in history. This was a compulsory book to read when I was in the fine arts course, you know, back at uni, so almost 20 years ago. I read this book. I'm now rereading it again. It's amazing. And once I finish reading it, I'm very happy to give it to somebody else. So just let me know who is in East London that would like to collect it from me. I'm just near the mosque, you know, the East London mosque. So you could always collect it from me, read it, and then pass it on to somebody else. So let's start a kind of a book club about art, where I'm very happy to give my books as long as you pass them on into the next student. Deal? We have a deal? Okay. Now I'm going to read. Has to do with shadows, the topic I'm choosing today. Have you ever read the Allegory of the Cave by Plato? So if you read the Allegory of the Cave, you're going to see that Plato describes reality as an illusion, pretty much. There is the real reality, of course, but, and I say of course because that has been challenged by postmodernism, but I think it's rubbish. Rubbish, you know, all this non-dualistic thing of, oh, you are me and I am you. That's all very good for abusers, okay? You are not me, I am not you. And there is a reality which is also external to us and to our understanding. So one thing that Plato said is that the perception of reality is different from reality itself, which I think makes total sense. We are conditioned by our 5 physical senses, and even our 5 physical senses are not very good. So there are optical illusions, there are auditory illusions, there's all sorts of illusions. And together with that, so John, you've read Plato, isn't that fantastic? The Allegory of the Cave, incredible text, incredible. And that's Plato quoting Socrates, because Socrates was Plato's master, and Socrates never wrote anything himself. Pretty much almost everything we know about Socrates was written by Plato. Socrates only wrote his apology and things like that. And I'm not even sure if he did that or if it was Plato as well. Now, we're talking now about shadows. We are talking about illusion, about perception. And the first legend that I would like to tell you is Buddhist. And so I'm now reading from this book, okay? I'm now on page 74. The idea of the shadow as a potential picture, only awaiting someone to fix it, recurs in Tibetan and Mongolian legends about the origin of the Buddha image. Several artists tried to paint Buddha's portrait, but their art failed them. So Buddha had his shadow traced and filled in with color. There's some beautiful legends about artists trying to capture reality and not being able to, and as such, they use the shadow as a means to read from life. The other legend I would like to tell you, which is quoted here as well in this book, it's taken from Pliny, and I believe the original material was by Herodotus. It's the myth of the birth of art, the Greek legend. And I always tell this story to my students when I teach presentially in classes. So according to this legend, this young girl, I believe from the city of Corinth, although this myth has got many variations. But one of the variations of this myth is that art was born in Corinth, in Greece. When this young girl, she had to say farewell to her boyfriend because he was going to war, he was a soldier, and suspecting that she would never see him alive again, with a bit of charcoal, she outlined his shadow so that she would never forget him. And that was the birth of drawing. So with a bit of charcoal, she outlines the shadow that he was casting on the wall. so that she would never forget him. It was an attempt to capture him forever, even after his passing. And then she wasn't wrong. He did die at war. And when his body was brought back, she was devastated. She only had that shadow to look at, you know, that outline in charcoal. So she asked her father for help. And this book actually tells the names of the people. So she was the daughter of Butades. The father was called Butades. So she asks for his help. And he's a very skilled potter. So together, they put some clay, some wet clay, inside the outlines that she had traced. And the father molds and creates the torso of the young man before his body rots away. And that was the birth of sculpture. So these very beautiful stories. Today I've told you a Buddhist tale and also an ancient Greek tale that was then rewritten again by the Romans. So these very beautiful stories say that shadows, they're places of oblivion, they're places of mystery, they're places where our perception fails us, and yet they can be also very helpful to try to create visual truth. So I'm going to start with this painting, and I will keep everything into the realm of vagueness, into the realm of shadows, all right? Let me know who wants to take this book first from East London, Aldgate East, okay? And then I'll pass it on to the next students. So I'm taking a gray that is going to be, I'll actually use the number 4. So the number 4 gray is roughly the same value as this blue that I have as a background color. And I will use this for my sketch. Absolutely, John. Sculpture formed in the mold, so it's from the shadow as well. And then Herodotus and Pliny, they complete the tale by saying that, and then the father baked the sculpture together with some pots that he was making that day. So it went to the oven. All right, so very, very, very watercolory. Acrylics dry darker, so it's going to be wet while... Oh, Isabel, books. I have a different set of books in Portuguese for my Portuguese students. So this is the ones for my London-based students, unless the book travels around London, and then when everybody reads it, they can give it back to me, and I can take it to Portugal and pass it around as well. But I have some different books for you, okay? Right. And at this stage, I'm just going to create a very, very rough... I'm really not interested at all in any sort of detail or anything of that kind. I just want to create a structure. I want to create... There's going to be houses underneath. I want to paint a hill with the Castle of Lydia at the very top. And I haven't said this before, but the reason being is that I'm going back to my old paintings of apparitions of angels at night. So this is going to be an image. Oh, Sangeeta, yes. If you type Leiria, you will... I have some images here that I can show you, but like I've told you, I'm going to paint mainly from imagination. So I'm warping the shapes and the colors. And I can show you one of the images in here, but I'm not going to do... I'm definitely not going to do an exact copy of this at all. So it's going to be all warped and from imagination. It's just that there's some architectonic details that I'm very interested in rendering, like some details from some sculptures in the city. That interests me. But like I was telling you, I'm going to repaint the series of apparitions of angels at night. And it really helps me to cope with the quarantine, because I think it's a kind of perhaps it's some sort of mystical interest that I have in this type of paintings, but it's also a way to travel. You know, I am painting my home country. I am painting my interpretation of my home country. So that's a way to travel and be there during the quarantine while we can't do this. As you can see, as the gray dries, it dries with the same value as the blue in the background. So it's great. And I'm not painting on a canvas crystal. I'm actually painting on a super rough watercolor paper. And there's one thing I want to tell you. I've just released on my YouTube the most comprehensive guide to choosing a watercolor or drawing paper anywhere to be found on the internet. It's released as... so if you go to YouTube and you type Nelson Ferreira watercolor papers, I've reviewed more than 50 different makes, and you must watch that video. Okay, it's about 40-something minutes. And I'm going through about 50 different makes of watercolor papers and drawing papers for artists, and which are the advantages and disadvantages of each. I'm now using a French make called Moulin de Larroque, which I adore. Very expensive paper, and I tinged it blue, so I painted it first, you know, just to give... it's a very, very rough paper. I'll show you later. So, like I was saying, I want to create these paintings based on memory, based on spirituality. And the subject is asking for low contrast. The subject asks for mystery. The subject asks for a lack of definition. So the subject is appropriate for what I'm teaching you now, which is to work with minimum shifts in value. Minimum. We're going to keep the whole painting really hazy, really lost. Minimum shifts of value. Now, as I've got some of these lines more or less marked in place, I'm going to start introducing a high chroma. Okay, enough for now. I'll take just a different brush. And I'm going to go colorful this time. By the way, acrylic gouache tends to scratch very easily. It's got a sensitive surface, so I always like to put a little bit of acrylic medium. And I picked this one from Lascaux because it's totally matte. I really love this. It's an amazing matte medium. It's totally flat. You know, there's no gloss. And so I like to mix a little bit of that medium with the paint, so it dries more scratch proof. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is literally create some accents of a bright color, so I can see the contrast myself between what is going to be bright, vivid, and what is going to be dull and grayish. It's important to create some sort of marks that will allow us to see what's happening. As usual, this is just a rough beginning. I will have to redraw most of these shapes anyway. I'm just creating a structure that I can see. And I have to tell you something. It's amazing to paint with gouache compared with oils in a studio setting, because the glare is just not going to exist once the paint dries, you know. And Sangeeta, your question. Acrylic gouache is actually a type of acrylic paint. Technically, it's not a gouache, but it's an acrylic paint that was conceived to dry totally matte and flat. So it mimics the look of gouache, but it's more resilient than gouache, you know, because, for example, acrylic gouache, when it dries, it's waterproof. It's water resistant, unlike conventional gouache that can easily be damaged. You know, if there's a flood in your house and the gouache paint catches water, that's it. All right? So we're going... Oh, indeed, John, I'm so relieved that there's no glare anymore, you know, once the paint dries. So I'll just create a few accents. And I will be playing with the roughness of the paper as well. This painting will be more expressionistic. Although I have a huge interest in classical painting, of course, but this painting will be mostly expressionistic. Now, notice that I can see that as the blue dries, it gets just ever so slightly almost darker than the background grey blue. So I'm going to add what? You tell me. Zinc white. And please start your paintings, okay? As you paint at home, mix all of your colors to a similar value. So when you squint, you need to squint a lot, you know, half close your eyes. And when you squint, all of your colors should look practically the same. There should be no difference between light and dark. So I'm going to add just a little bit of white. I can hear the rain outside, it's beautiful. I say it's beautiful because I'm not outside. Okay, and a lot of this work will be done. A lot of it is from imagination, like I've told you before. So I won't be playing too much with different. I won't be playing too much with reality, because this painting needs to come from the heart. It needs to be from imagination. It needs to be from emotion. Of course, that classical training always plays a role, in the sense that whatever I do and paint, I will be able to draw the shapes just as I want them to be, or the colors just as I want them to be. But I definitely want these colors to be a bit dreamy, a bit... And because today's lesson will be... It's going to be a tough lesson for you, because not much is happening at this stage. By removing the contrasts of value, that means you can't really see much. The painting has to build up for the magic to happen. But one thing I would like to teach you as I go along is that you can start playing with hues. So for example, I've got a greener blue, which I've just applied. And now I'm going to apply also a purpler blue. And I will start playing with different hues of the same value. So one will be greener, another will be purpler, but they're roughly the same value. So one is not lighter than the other. So if I show you here, they're almost the same value. You know, you see, one is greener, one is purpler. And I really, really, really love to paint like this. And to play with different values and hues and shades. Of course, that because the time is humid, today is a very wet day, our paints will not dry as quickly as usual, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. I'm working still as a kind of a watercolory, so there's lots of water on the paint, mixed with the paint, because I want to make sure that I don't build any sort of impasto, I don't build any sort of texture in the wrong places, you know, because I'm still designing the shapes. And as I design the shapes, it's crucial not to create bold statements which you might regret later. So highly recommend acrylic gouache, but you can also paint with normal standard acrylics. Right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start exaggerating these contrasts between purple, you know, a purple blue and a green blue. So I'll be a bit more blocky. I think you can still see the whole thing. The glare will eventually disappear once this dries. And now composition-wise, I will have some sections which will be more purplish. I would have other sections that will be more greenish. I will have other sections which will be grayish. And I will have some other sections, maybe, which will be even brownish to offset the blues. But I still haven't decided about using brown. It might just be blues and grays. I still don't know. The type of brush. I'm just using a cheap brush. So it's a soft synthetic brush. Always use cheap brushes as you start your painting, okay? Only use expensive brushes towards the end of your paintings. So for the first layer, oh, this one is called Eggshell. I don't know what that is. And it's probably a makeup brush, because I found that makeup brushes tend to be better value for money in terms of the cheap ones than artists' brushes, which are usually so overpriced and so ridiculously expensive for what they are, you know. It doesn't justify. So I don't know if you can see that, but I'm starting to have blue and purple. And what's beautiful about color contrasts and color harmonies is that this blue and this purple are almost the same color. But when you compress values so much that you don't have light and dark, and when you play exclusively with similar hues, our brain imagines a huge contrast. So our brain imagines that this blue is actually green, which is not. This is not green at all. This is actually a primary blue. But because it sits next to a purple, our brain gets confused and exaggerates these contrasts of hue. So you can really push contrasts of hue when you paint like this. I'm going to introduce a third hue. Why not? This one is going to be... if you want to know which colors I'm using, just because, I'm using a sky blue by Turner. I'm using a cobalt blue hue, also by Turner. And I'm using a primary cyan by Holbein. So far, these are the three shades I've been using. And then I like a bit of medium, so I'm using the Serious beautiful acrylic medium, very matte. And it's all about illusion. Remember that. It's all about illusion. I'm using a zinc white. In this case, it's a Delaroni. Just to gently lighten some of these colors, if necessary. But like I was saying, it's all about illusion. So our brain will imagine all sorts of different colors and hues, although they might not be there. Let's test how this dries, because now the paint is so light, because it's so wet. But we will see how it dries later. Okay. So I'm not going to be bothered now with much more of this. Enough for now. Time to visit the architecture. Time to go back to some of those grays. So I'm using a golden number 4 neutral gray, because it's the same value as these colors I've picked. You know, they're all the same value. So one is not lighter or darker than another, hopefully. Or if it is, it's minimal. So we have to work with minimal shifts of value. It's the scope of this exercise. I would like you all to paint, try to paint like this. It's going to be a nightmare for beginners. A nightmare, because it's actually very, very hard to paint with no values showing you what you are doing. You know, it's almost like you can't see, because there's no light and dark, you know, there's no... All this light and dark you see right now, it's just because the paint is wet. The moment the paint dries, everything will be the same value. So you can't see. A nightmare. Why am I asking you to do nightmares? I don't know. I think it's partially because you have to be out of your comfort zone, and you have to be out of your, you know, usual box in order to improve. in order to create something meaningful, artists have always learned that when they set themselves a series of limitations, they usually come up with the most unexpected results. So why am I asking you to go a bit crazy? I'm just going to create a slightly lighter value, but minimally so. Minimally so. Because like I said at the start of the lesson, you always need a little bit of value. Otherwise you can't really see what's happening, you know, you can't really see the... So this is going to dry just a little bit lighter than that one. Just a little. But at the moment, they're both quite light because they're both wet. So the Castle of Lydia is a place where I used to go all the time, when I was a child especially. It's really nice, it's really magical. Like many places in Portugal, we have lots of fortresses and castles, especially in the interior of the country. And the reason being is that Portugal and Spain have always been friends and enemies and etc. Nowadays we're very good friends. I mean, I love the Spanish and I love Spain, and they do the same with Portugal. But for almost 700 years we've been like, you know, fighting like little brothers. John, I'm so happy to know that you're writing down your dreams when you wake up. It's amazing, isn't it, John? You'll have hundreds of ideas for your future paintings. It's just spectacular. Everybody should be doing The Artist's Way, you know, the book. The book I recommended a few lessons ago. Now, back to this. I'm still using the slightly paler grey, just to start constructing the city underneath. But a lot of this is going to be from imagination. I really want to create a visual statement and not just paint something in front of me. So this is going to be a bit more emotional as a painting, you know, a bit more. I want this sculpture to be there. So classical Portuguese houses are usually decorated with some ornate sculptures, either Baroque or neoclassical. So there tends to be some really beautiful architectural elements, which unfortunately in the 70s people were demolishing because they thought, oh, we want to be modern, whatever that is. And that's really stupid, because, and that's another critique I have on postmodernism, is that it has really destroyed a lot of the local nuances between the different peoples and countries, and I'm very critical of the modern school of architecture, very critical, because it doesn't matter if you are in Portugal or in England or in China or in India, you see exactly the same type of buildings. Exactly the same type of buildings, without taking into account any sort of context. I find this so short-sighted and so blind. How can someone be trained into a visual art like architecture without taking into account the visuals of the location where you are making your building? It's really, really stupid, you know? So I'm very critical of the modern school of architecture in general, because it's all post-Bauhaus and just copying Le Corbusier, which is boring to death. And it just goes all across the world. It's like this disease, you know? But thankfully, a lot of people in Portugal started reacting against that. And nowadays we have a very, very good school of modern architecture, which takes into account the local elements and the local tastes and history and specificities, you know, because we shouldn't really be destroying we shouldn't really be destroying our landscapes and our cities with alien experiments. So it's exactly the same in painting. I want to create this so subtle, that when people look at the final painting, initially they will have trouble seeing what I have painted. It has to be a mystery, you know? Because I'm talking about the allegory of the cave. I'm talking about illusion. I'm painting an illusion. I'm painting a dream world, a reality. And at the same time, I'm giving you a lesson. And I thought, let's use this as an opportunity to teach you about compression of values, make everything super compressed, and create... yeah, exactly. Look at the South Bank on the Thames near Vauxhall. I mean, some things are nice, but yeah, I think it ages badly. The problem I have with a lot of strange architecture. Let's not forget this. It's the most expensive art. I mean, who's going to give you a few millions for you to create a building, right? It's very expensive. It's different from painting, where with a few thousands, you conceive a building. And because architecture is so tied up with money, they usually need to... There are budgets, you know? They usually need to cut costs. But unfortunately, long term, that's going to warp our cities, and that creates really strange... I don't mind modern art at all. I love it. I just hate the fact that it's everywhere, you know? It doesn't matter if you're in Africa or in the North Pole. It's the same type of buildings. That's just stupid. You know, when I studied, for example, when I was at school, the school where I studied, the primary school, was taken from the Swedish models of schools. And of course, in Portugal, we have sun. In Sweden, not really. So, I'll never forget these massive windows. And we were literally baking by the sun. Because as the sun poured in Portugal, you were just literally boiling with all the sunlight coming through. Why? Because the architect took it from a Northern European design. All right? So don't be brainwashed by money. Don't be brainwashed by stars. Like a lot of architects, they became this kind of gods for some reason, which I don't understand. Nobody's a god, okay? So don't be brainwashed by celebrity and, oh, he's such a good architect because he's famous. It's just pompous. So, can you start seeing what's happening in the painting? Because I don't know if that's showing or not. The compression of values creates already a dreamlike world. So the castle is starting to look eerie. And I'm definitely not going to paint any sort of strong contrasts anywhere. I will try to leave things as vague as possible, but still with some strength. Okay? Vague, subtle, and strong. That's what I want to create. And remember, all these highlights you see now is just because the paint is wet. As soon as it dries, it will darken as much as those. So it's all going to be very, very, very dreamy. Now let me check the time. Yeah, we still have 15 minutes. Time goes so quickly. It's not fair, you know? It's really not fair. Just going to start massing in these grays to obliterate the bluish background, because this is all going to be houses and architecture. And you work rough. You just... Initially, you have to start painting loose and rough, and then as the painting advances, you tighten it more and more and more. But your first coats can be quite free and loose. beginners, if you don't have practice and you're afraid to, if you're afraid to create bold, loose brush strokes, I don't mind if you paint tight from the start. You know, I really don't mind if you, as long as you create something that is still meaningful to you. So I'm not suggesting that bold and loose is better than rough, or than tight and detailed. Not at all. But always create something that is meaningful to you, not to anyone else, okay? Don't listen to your partners. Don't listen to your friends. Don't listen to to all of those people, because they don't know anything about art. You know better, all right? Because you love art. So Raji, you asked me if brush strokes are not visible when painting with acrylic gouache. They can be. Why do you mean they're not visible? They can be. You see the brush strokes I've done there, just because the colors are different. But I don't recommend you to paint thickly. What do you mean brush strokes? Do you mean in pastel? Do you mean thickness? Then yes, you can't. When you paint with acrylic gouache, you have to paint thin, like gouache. Otherwise the paint might crack. I mean, Holbein's paints, they don't crack, they say. But I find it unnecessary anyway, a lot of thickness. I usually don't work in such a fashion unless I want to create a bold statement. But notice, again, and I'm always talking about the same things on purpose, to brainwash you. Notice how the compression of values starts to create this very dreamy, it's a really strange type of landscape, you know, it's a really mysterious, very, very, very hard to pin what is in here. I mean, you still can't see that it's a castle. Eventually you'll be able to see it as I carry on this painting. But I love painting in such a fashion where there is almost nothing to look at. Because your brain, when your brain faces this type of images where there's hardly anything to look at, you have this explosion in your mind, and your mind starts hallucinating, literally. Your mind starts imagining that some of these colors are stronger than what they really are. All sorts of things just happen when you don't have much to look at. Reinhardt, let me see if I have a book in here which I'd like to show you. Give me a second, okay? It's a really, really good book. I should have had it prepared because I didn't know I was going to talk about him. I usually improvise my lessons as I go along, so I can't find the book at the moment, but I'll show you maybe next week. So like I said, I like to improvise the lessons and just talk according to the questions that you are asking me. Now, I'm almost getting ready for the questions and answers, Q&A. So maybe if you could type them now, so that I can answer in a minute or two. So if you have questions, please write them down now. All right, I'm just going to open my Facebook here so I can read what you guys... No, Laura, I haven't seen the building in Shanghai yet. I spent 2 months in China, but I was only on the south of China, and that was wonderful. But again, there you go. In terms of architecture, it just looks like Oslo. We could be in Norway, you know, pretty much, of what they've done. So like I was saying, there's hardly anything to look at. And that creates an explosion in your minds where you really don't know what is reality anymore. So I'm still playing with this concept of shadow, this concept of like the allegory of the cave of Plato, you know. We're painting with vague colors, very vague. let me accent now some of these blues. Let's create some statements. I can also use color to design the shapes of the castle, so you can use that to trim. You know, you literally trim the shapes with color. The apparitions of angels, they will come later. I will paint them on this image, definitely. And like I said, this makes sense because it's a more spiritual type of subject. So it makes total sense to create an image that is eerie, and that goes beyond our physical reality. That goes beyond the way we, how can I say, goes beyond the way we usually perceive the world. Okay. Let me go back to a green or two. I really, really love gouache paint. It's very underrated. For some reason, most artists don't use it. And it's really, really shameful that such a beautiful medium has been almost forgotten. Right. So this will have to dry eventually before we can complete the painting, because at the moment the values are all over the place, because some areas are wet, some areas are dry. So we will have to wait until everything dries up, which is good because we are pretty much ending the lesson. Questions? Nobody's asking questions. Why? Why? Huh? Am I talking to the dummy? Come on. Come on, lads and ladettes. Give me some feedback, all right? Questions about gouache. I really want to see your experiments as well. So I really want to see a lot of studies that you are making with pretty much just one value. All right? Sangeeta, if your Daleroni doesn't say acrylic gouache, it's probably not acrylic gouache. It's probably just acrylic. The range between gouache and oils are different. So oils tend to be deeper in the darks, but gouache has got a luminosity in the lights that won't turn yellow. That's why. Ian, the advantage of using gouache over acrylics is that they're so matte. I love the matteness. All right? I really love the matteness. And Raji, I don't know if I will finish this painting next week or not, but I will try to work on it next week. Yes, I will try my very best. So try to really, really, really push to the limits of what you can see and what you can't see. You know? Angela, definitely gouache is not fashionable. Don't ask me why. It's a beautiful medium. Beautiful, beautiful medium. Ayan, no, gouache dries straight away. So gouache is water-based. You know, the moment the water evaporates, the paint is dry. It's beautiful. And yes, John, I'll show the finished nudes as well as the portrait. Okay, just finishing off. Oh, that was light. Just finishing off some of those some of that paint that I have on the palette, so it's not sent to waste. But remember, it's all meant to dry with a similar value. Even these light grays that I've used here on the castle, they're just going to be for me to see the shapes, because at the very end I'm going to glaze them a bit darker. So I'm going to almost kill 100% all the contrasts between light and dark. It's going to be as flat as possible. So let me just waste the remainder of the paint. Yeah. And I believe there's still no more questions. I'm very disappointed on you. Very. Come on, give me 25 more questions at least. All right? 25 more questions. Enough for today. Okay. Let's leave this to dry. And I'm ready to take questions. We still have 5 minutes, so I'll just be staring and I won't speak until I see a question. So it's your fault if this becomes the dullest lesson in the world. So Ian, gouache behaves like watercolor, but gouache is opaque. Sangeeta, yes, I'm now painting the sky above the castle. And using up paint on the palette can get you into trouble if you do it quickly. Sometimes, yes. But when you have experience, you can pretty much do anything, you know? And thanks, Ian, for asking all those questions. So essentially, gouache is water-based. It dries quickly. You can't paint thickly because it's brittle, so it can crack. It's more like a watercolor. You know, watercolors you also don't paint thickly. And for how long does the palette stay wet? It stays wet for as long as there is water underneath on the kitchen paper that I've put underneath. If you want to leave your paint overnight, you can. So you can cover it. So if your plastic box has got a lid, just put on the lid, all right? And it lasts overnight. I don't recommend more than 1 day because it starts going moldy. It starts rotting. And definitely you can mix gouache with watercolors. They're compatible. And now I've got a question in here. What type of paintings are better to gouache or oil? Or there is nothing better as oil? I would like to say that different mediums say different things. So oils are better for very, very, very smooth transitions. You know, Gabriella, it's like oils are better to paint like the Mona Lisa, you know, where you have smooth transitions, or to paint like Van Gogh, almost like lumps of paint. Because if you paint thickly with gouache, it cracks. All right, so that's what oils are best for. Gouache is better for colors that don't fade and change over time. So these blues will be just as blue 100 years from now because they don't yellow. And gouache is also best for if you want a painting to be totally matte, where there's no sheen, there's no gloss, nothing like that. And I would say gouache is practical because you can travel, you can paint on location, and then you can take it back home without smudging your painting. As with oils, they stay wet for a week, you know. So yeah, I like all mediums, but I love the madness of gouache as well. Oh, Isabel, that's very kind of you. I'm running lessons every Sunday, and I will run them for as long as I have energy, you know, and especially during the quarantine, I promised to all my students that I'd be running free sessions on Sundays so that everybody could still have some sort of artistic, you know, stimulation. But I'm also launching the paid lessons, which I'm going to give you feedback about your artworks. And I apologize, I still didn't have time to email anybody because I've got so many commissions for paintings that I've literally been painting non-stop. So Gabriella, no, with gouache, you can repair as quickly as with oils because gouache paint is opaque. So for example, imagine I don't want this to be blue, I suddenly want this to be orange. No problem. I take orange paint and cover it. Imagine I want this to become white. No problem. I take white paint and cover it. Does that make sense? So with gouache, you can really fix things. So essentially, it looks like acrylics, but it's matte. I prefer gouache. It's very beautiful. It doesn't have that plastic sheen of acrylics. So I think we're all good for now. I managed to start my painting and teach you about the advantages of gouache and things. Please share this video. I'm very disappointed with my English crowd. Guys, I want to say something. When I release a video in Portuguese, I've got 80, 90, 100 shares easily. When I release a video in English, Come on, Londoners, you can do better. All right. I know Londoners are known for having no friends. Huh? It's partially true. Londoners are known for having no friends, but you can still share it. You know, there will be somebody on your wall that will have a look into the video. Ha! Come on, grumpy Londoners. You can do better than this. I'm a grumpy Londoner myself, don't forget. You know, I've got dual citizenship. But come on, grumpy us, we can do better than this. Right. So thanks everybody for attending another lesson. Please post on the comments the... Thanks, Ian, for sharing. You always share. And by the way, I know who shares and who doesn't. You're becoming the teacher's pet, Ian. Thank you for that. I would like you to, on the comments below, after the lesson is over, please post some of the paintings you've been doing with similar values. I mean, you can have a bit of light and dark, but try to make everything very flat. It's more about hue or chroma, not so much about value. And I will carry on. Oh, Sangita, you selfish thing. Just because you dance, you only share your dance videos. What about me? Huh? You have to give me cake and a latte next time we meet, okay? Right. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody next Sunday at the same time. Thanks, everyone. And please post your images and the paintings and try, this exercise. Try to reduce your value range. I don't want to see a lot of lights and I don't want to see a lot of darks. I want to see everything somewhere in the middle. Okay? Bye to everybody.